Hi, my name is Anna, and in the second episode of the Business of Aspiration video series, we have here Lee Maschmeyer, who is Chief Creative Officer at Chobani, and he's been in that role for some years now, and in the course of his tenure has basically put, or rather fast forward the Chobani on the cultural map, if I may say that, with a number of different initiatives. And the reason I wanted to talk to Lee right now in this particular moment is, in addition for all those initiatives over the years, in the past 2 months, Chobani has done some very noteworthy partnerships. For example, the first one that caught my eye was with Trade, which is coffee roasters, right? Coffee roasters. Coffee roasters, like, I don't know, what is it, a platform or a organization that supports local coffee shops. So that was aligned with your overall purpose that food is a force for good in life, and that was aligned with their purpose that coffee is for good in life. And then I also saw a couple of more, which is Chobani Pantry, which I don't know a lot about. And then the third one is Milk and Cookies that support local farmers. That's some that I've seen. And the reason I sort of noted these initiatives is not just for the purpose of themselves, but more of something I've been thinking about, which is, going forward, how can companies, big companies like Chobani, how can they be as pro-social as they're pro-economic? And I almost feel like in the future there won't be any more B Corps, because all companies will have to somehow incorporate the social component, not just in terms of, oh, this is in corporate responsibility department or this is a marketing play, but actually to put it at the center of their organization, their P&L and their business. So that means that they would need to apply the same rigor in terms of KPIs and accountability that they apply to their business objectives to the social objectives. I have not seen a lot of this. So I would like to hear how you guys are doing and thinking about it.
Yeah, well, I think that's a really great setup, and thank you for that. The idea behind Chobani, I think, in many ways can be traced back to actually what Chobani means. It means shepherd in Turkish. And so the very idea of being able to take care of a flock, I think, is mythically and metaphorically central to the culture of Chobani. So in almost every initiative that we do, there's always some level of conversation of like, what else can we do for our community, for people within our value chain, people for our consumer and stuff. And I think you bring up a really important topic, which is one that we've actually talked about within Chobani, which is, how do you move that type of activity from just being a marketing or a CSR activity into something that is actually considered a business activity? And for us, it's really come down to essentially two things, and they're pretty kind of like no-brainer things, but they are necessary for that transition. And one is focusing on the places that are part of our value chain, as opposed to chasing something that is outside of it, and trying to build equity in a space that we don't have credibility in. How do we focus on the places where we already play? So I'll come back to that later. And the second one is just quite simply just setting business goals according to it. And business goals don't necessarily have to be profit. In fact, they shouldn't always be profit. But it goes back to that first point. What is a business goal that we would care about in terms of taking care of small farmers in our supply chain? What is a business goal that we can take care of, where we can take care of people in our community, where there is that mutual benefit, where there is that strengthening of both sides of the partnership? And so when we think about our value chain, and we go back to those small farmers where we source a lot of our milk, we know that they are going through a very difficult economic transition right now, driven by globalization and the flood of milk on the market and stuff. And many of them don't have business models that can sustain that. So we created the Milk Matters initiative as a way to take care of them, because those are not just our suppliers of milk, they're also the people who support those local small farms. And so we really believe in local milk. We really believe in community health. And so the more that we can take care of those, the more the kind of like basic inputs into our company are more robust and well taken care of. Then when you think about it on the business side of things, you know, being able to have tighter relationships and a better understanding of those stakeholders in the value chain allows us to build stronger relationships of trust and that pay off in difficult times like we have right now. It allows us insight into ways that we might be able to work together that benefit both parties from an economic perspective. So it's really basic, but it really is at the end of the day just taking that mindset of not treating this as like corporate social responsibility and trying to do something good in the world, but like how do we create a business model around doing good?
Right, that's exactly where I was sort of aiming at that. And do you think that how should I put this? Like how accessible is this model to basically other companies? You guys were set up like that, so it's almost easier when you're set up like that from the moment. I don't know, maybe you haven't been set up, but it sounds like you've been set up pretty early on in your growth. In a way to take care of like different stakeholders in the value chain, or actually to have that relationship of social responsibility towards each other. How can a company that doesn't have that can basically retrofit their model?
Well, where there's a will, there's a way, right?
Mm-hmm.
So when Chobani first started out, it was set up to make and distribute yogurt. It wasn't set up to run all of these initiatives from a business perspective. Certainly, the founder always had this belief in taking care of people. It's that shepherd and flock kind of relationship. But there was really no structure or scale around it. It was a lot of ad hoc stuff. You know, on one hand, we would give out free yogurt around Christmas to everyone in the communities where our factories are.
Mm-hmm.
In another hand, we would hire refugees. In another instance, we would refurbish baseball parks in upstate New York. So it was more just like where there was a need, we gave money. But as the company has scaled, we've started to shift that more towards how can we focus our efforts so they build on top of each other? How do we measure the impact that we are having? And how do we create an ecosystem of activity that is mutually reinforcing of each other in a way that isn't just giving for the sake of giving, but is also giving as a way to strengthen the overall system that we play in.
Right.
And so that's when you have that's when you have more business oriented conversations around structuring the activity. And that's, you end up figuring out a way. So you don't have to have a founder who wants to do this. You just have to have the will to do it. And then the rest can be figured out.
Right. I mean, I absolutely agree. As long as it's like sort of corporate mandate and it has a buy-in from a lot of people, then you're sort of, this is the goal, like this is the ball go, like in a sense. And I mean, I was just looking at the questions in order to kind of set that up. If I were to ask you, like, what links those three initiatives, and sort of like you kind of released the three of them in a very quick succession, and you're clearly organizationally set up to do that. But why trade coffee? For me, it was not like a yogurt and coffee. It's not for me the most natural. I understand overall on the vision level, but on the mechanics and on how did that partnership come to be?
Yeah, so there's a difference between initiatives that a company does and then partnerships, right? So I think there's two slightly different strategies there.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
The initiative that the company does is more towards the core value chain that it participates in. So small dairy farmers is a really good example for us. But partnerships are a little different in that partnerships are an opportunity to reach out to a community of people that we could support, but we don't have the credibility in, or expose our company to a group of like-minded people who might not have been typical Chobani shoppers. So when we think of trade, for example, trade overlapped with Chobani on the social good aspect. So there was a values alignment there. There's also an overlap there in terms of product quality. So when we think of partnerships, we're looking at ways of dimensionalizing the brand and finding ways to refresh the core equities that we stand for so that we don't become stagnant in what we're talking about. It doesn't mean that coffee all of a sudden becomes our main initiative for the next 2 or 3 years. It just is a way to bring some news and excitement and some dynamism to our company with a like-minded partner.
Right. And are those partnerships planned to continue, or were they one-off?
Typically, we approach them from a one-off in the majority.
Mm-hmm.
There are other partnerships, like our partnership with No Child Hungry and Feeding America, which are longer-term, institutionalized partnerships, which we return to again and again.
Right. And do you have any KPIs associated with sort of either having that support throughout the value chain or through partnerships? Do you say, hey, that really, like, do you translate it in sales, or do you have a social KPIs, which is much harder because once you go beyond share of voice or awareness or positive perception, how do you actually measure good?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I mean, especially there are the idea of first order and second order KPIs, right? And so I think the easiest ones for us to stay focused on is the first order KPIs, things that we can directly impact. The second order KPIs are ones that are the outcome of other KPIs that we impact. So when we're thinking of Feeding America, for example, it's something we're doing right now. The second order KPIs would be, you know, the elimination of hunger over a period of time for a certain region of people. We can't directly do that because we have to partner with Feeding America to do that. Feeding America is the distribution and allocation and amplification mechanism which makes that possible. But what we can do is we can provide Feeding America the means with which to do it, right? So our KPI with them is helping solve some of their KPIs. So food supply, volunteers, donation amounts, and things like that. If we can help them reach those KPIs, then we know that we've made them more effective at the job that they're doing, which results in those second order KPIs.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It definitely makes sense, and that led me to thinking that is sort of, it can be perceived as naive to say, oh, you know, like doing good, they're like blah, but it's like, first, yeah, measurability, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about that companies like yours, at the end of the day, you're business entities. Mm-hmm. You're in a business of selling products, and in order to be a viable business enterprise, you need to make money. So for me, it's like you're not a B Corp, but at the same time, it does sound like what brings me to the beginning, that there needs to be more of those doing good initiatives. So where does the money come from for that if they're not making money? So how do you sort of, does it mean that you need to accept the degrowth, that you accept like lower P&L targets and slower growth, or how does that sort of equate?
Yeah, so if you want to connect some of these initiatives back to more business specific stuff, absolutely. The KPIs associated with some of this stuff are a little different depending on what the initiative is. So if it is a donation initiative, for instance, like giving to Feeding America, or No Child Hungry partnership that we did in Grand Central Terminal a couple years ago, or the recent Chobani Pantry one that we did. Right. Certainly those things can have impact on brand. And in moving forward, a lot of brand marketing budgets are being cut and moved over into digital or performance marketing, mainly because that stuff is much more measurable. than a lot of brand marketing stuff. So what I've noticed is a lot of brand marketing is built on these initiatives. And so the KPIs in terms of reach of earned media impressions, positive sentiment, things like that are ways to amplify the brand and the values of the brand through the actions of the brand. And so we recently, like, I'll give you an example. We had a huge success when we learned about the issue of lunch shaming in the country. And if the people watching are familiar with lunch shaming, essentially a lot of schools have lunch debts that students create. And the majority of those students who carry those lunch debts come from families who are unable to pay for school lunches. And there's a big problem with lunch programs for economically disadvantaged families in our country. It's not even worth getting into now. So essentially what ends up happening is that these children who don't have lunch money and can't afford lunch rack up these debts. Eventually the school has to pay off those debts. And so the school is taking, in often cases, draconian measures to recoup that debt from students by publicly shaming them. They stamp the students with hand stamps that say no lunch money. They make kids eat things like peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, which everyone in the school knows means that the kid can't afford lunch. And they've gone so extreme. There's one school district in Pennsylvania that actually sent out a letter to parents threatening that Child Protective Services were going to take their kids away from them unless they paid the lunch debt. And so this is collectively known as lunch shaming, and it's a massive and growing problem, but a quiet problem across all states. Mm-hmm. And so what we did was, very shortly, we learned about an issue in Warwick, Rhode Island, and paid off the full lunch debt for that school and challenged other companies and people to help eliminate, as a short-term solution, this lunch debt in their own backyards. And the post basically went viral and got us, not that this was the reason we did it, but it goes to show how an action like this can impact brand. It got us an incredible amount of praise in return, headlines, and it was a great way for us to show what we believe as a company, but also in a space that we're credible in. We've had a partnership with No Child Hungry for a very long time. This is not some random thing that we did. We have a legacy of combating child hunger, and this was just the most recent way that we've done it in a slightly more public manner. So brand building metrics definitely are a way that we can connect these social good actions to a business need. Another way is if we are creating partnership packaging on the shelf. It's a way for us to bring news to a shelf that has been around for quite a while. So yogurt, Greek yogurt, our Greek yogurt has been around for 10 plus years. Mm-hmm. It's been the same Greek yogurt for a long time. Certainly we had the packaging and brand refresh, but there's always a need to bring new news to blueberry, mm-hmm. or to coconut or to strawberry that people buy every single day. Mm-hmm. So when we do these partnerships with America's Farm Trust or Operation Homefront, we are bringing an opportunity for people to participate in the initiatives that are near and dear to our company through their purchases. And so that brings some new news to the shelf, and oftentimes many grocers get behind these and want to help amplify these as part of their own individual stories. So they cut us slotting fees, so we don't have to pay slotting fees to put product on the shelf and stuff. So that can be a really important cost savings for us because we are bringing some social good new news to the shelf. Then in other cases, you know, a lot of these initiatives, especially these one-off things like with Trade or La Colombe or Cotopaxi more recently, are ways for us to build our first-party database so that when we do have these smaller product launches that we don't want to put national paid media dollars behind, we have a growing and robust first-party database that we can use as our baseline to start marketing a lot of these products to without obviously expending large media dollars to do it. So there's a cost savings and opportunity creation there as well. So it really just depends on how you want to engineer it.
Right. I see what you're saying. I mean, goes back to when there is a will, there is a way. At the end of the day is like you can always attach some sort of metrics, marketing metrics that translate into sales down the line. You say primary and secondary. And if you have to like say like let's look at the big picture and like macro level, and then maybe all then on also on a micro level, what would be the biggest obstacles in sort of implementing either partnerships or this sort of thinking? Because if this were easy, I would think more companies would have been doing it, because it's good marketing at the end of the day. This is the fastest, the most reliable way to build a brand. It is the fastest way to build positive brand affinity. So more people would do that rather than those like violin like sad spots that we are seeing right now, that are all this, the same, which I understand when they're coming from. The same time, that feels lazy and feels like a shortcut, like do something. And that brings me to that last question of obstacles, and then do this versus like it's actions, not words.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I think that's a really awesome question. And while it sounds easy in the way that I've sort of pitched it in this conversation, like anything, the difficulty is in the specifics. So one thing that I think a lot of companies trip over is this question of making an authentic and credible choice of what to focus on. With all the awards given at Cannes to these types of campaigns and initiatives, now everyone's trying to push some sort of feel good kind of brand marketing initiative and stuff. And so I won't name any names, but there have been many that have been attached to companies that you're just like, why are you doing this? Like it doesn't make any sense, or it feels opportunistic because there's no legacy of a company doing that when no one was paying attention. So one thing is, if you're a company that doesn't have that legacy, you need to start working on that legacy before you go out and start beating your chest and getting people to look at the great things that you're doing. Start small, start consistently, work with the gatekeepers, work grassroots, do things away from the spotlight, and earn the right to say things publicly. That takes time, but that also protects you in case something goes wrong, or excuse me, people start trying to call you out as opportunistic. You can point to the legacy. I think the other thing is, a lot of people at companies are overworked. Companies have a really easy job of saying yes to stuff. They have a harder time saying no to stuff. In many cases, are killing things. I should be more specific. A lot of people just have too much stuff to do. And a lot of companies have their ways of doing things. And if you're going to build brand a certain way or do email acquisition a certain way, that's the way it's done. If it works, why change it to insert this type of thing? So I think a lot of people don't feel that they have the capacity or the opportunity to fight that organizational inertia to do this type of stuff.
Right.
And then finally, I think there's a lot of fear associated with this type of stuff. There can often be conversations of, well, what if this upsets somebody? Or what if a certain portion of our consumer doesn't believe in this initiative or gets upset by this initiative? I think that's a decision a company has to come to terms with. When you take a stand, you are naturally drawing a line in the sand. And if you support things that are platitudes, in a sense, where you aren't taking a stand in some way, they don't resonate with people. They seem like the easy decisions. The more that you can choose as an organization of what you are going to get behind and what you're not going to get behind, the more that you can put out initiatives that have true impact to themselves and get dollars and attention or support where it's needed. And that's a very hard conversation. That is a very hard conversation, because in many ways you are choosing to sacrifice profit for purpose to a certain extent. And I don't think that's always the case. I think profit and purpose can certainly go well together, but there are times when you have to choose one over the other for a particular initiative. And I think too often companies want to walk the neutral middle line and not make waves. And that's, I think that's an appropriate choice for some companies. And I think it's a unfortunate choice for other companies.
I think this is a fantastic point. I really like the way you broke it down. And I think at the end of the day, it's like what kind of company you want to be, and if you want to take a stand. And taking a stand is going to cost you. And sometimes someday someone is not going to be happy and they're going to call. But if you have that series of micro actions that are all aligned towards greater good, then you have to point out to that. And I'm familiar with that from fashion. And then sustainability is like, oh, you have a sustainable packaging, but what about all the other stuff? So you can't really win in that. So that's a very valid point. At the same time, I don't think it should prevent companies from.
Yeah, it's all engineering. Like where there's a will, you will figure it out. If you are want to do something great in one area of your company and you have a weakness or exposed another area of your company, doesn't mean you can't do anything. It just means you have to come up with a fig leaf or a way to address the concerns in the other area. And it's totally possible. And I think there's one last thing that's worth throwing in is really early on in my time with Chobani, we did a study where we put out a lot of different kind of issues in the world to our community and did a test. And we learned what they really cared about. We can say what we care about, but it's also important to hear about what the community that you represent, the culture that you represent deeply cares about. And so for us, it was the food culture and people who believe in a life of emotional and nutritional wellness. So we wanted to know what they cared about, and we looked at the overlaps of those things. And so when we have initiatives come up that might be a bit controversial, or when we have to draw the line in something, we often go back to that overlap to say, we care about this and our community cares about it. That's the most important thing. Right. Because this isn't necessarily something that we're using to, increase product sales. This is something that is going to be building brand equity, which means we have to constantly reinforce in new ways core things that we have always stood for, which means we have to go back to our community, our culture that we're a part of, and essentially the bedrock principles of our company, and measure it against that, not against the person who buys yogurt once every 6 months and we want to get them to buy yogurt once every 3 months.
Right. So always like testing that relationship and how it evolves, because it will evolve. You can't use the same thing 10 years ago that it's now. Anyway, fantastic point. And I mean, I think that's a terrific way to actually end this conversation, because I think we covered a lot of ground here. And I thank you very much for your time and for your wonderful insights.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Thank you.